Hello friends, my dear students and my colleagues in physiology and medicine. Here is a new topic. The topic is related to the nervous system. It involves lots of circuits in the nervous system and the topic is maintenance of the body's equilibrium. Let me give you some examples. If you are seated in a train and the train suddenly starts moving, you might have experienced that the body tends to go off balance, but then quickly regains the balance. We regain the equilibrium and the balance very quickly, reflexly. This was a horizontal linear acceleration that started suddenly. The head was thrusted forward suddenly. Head was thrust in a particular direction. So, how is it that the body regain its equilibrium and balance very quickly? Or we are in an elevator and the elevator suddenly starts. What happens? Again the same thing. Now this time it is vertical linear acceleration of the head and of the body, of course. But then as it suddenly starts, the elevator started and we tend to go off balance, but then we quickly regain the equilibrium and posture and balance of the body. So how is it that the balance is achieved and maintained in the face of linear accelerations of the head? Or even when we are standing still, gravity is constantly pulling the head down, and yet we maintain the upright position of the head and the body position and body's balance is maintained. So which neuronal circuits are involved in this? They are responsible for maintaining the body's equilibrium. We will describe all those circuits. And mainly then the discussion will revolve around the vestibular system, vestibular apparatus, and its role in the maintenance of body's equilibrium balance in various these situations which I mentioned just now. Toward the end, we will also describe what are the symptoms when there is a disturbance in the vestibular system. We will also see why there are oscillatory movements of the eyes when the head spins around itself. We have all played this game when we were kids, that we spin around our own axis, round and round, and then when we stop suddenly, there are rotations of the eyes or oscillatory jerky movements of the eyes for a few seconds. Why is that? What's the reason for that? We'll describe all those things, and then we will also discuss about the motion sickness, seasickness, vertigo. All these things are somewhere related to the vestibular apparatus, vestibular system. So major part of our discussion will describe the neural circuitry involved in the body's equilibrium. Then we will also discuss the structure of the vestibular apparatus. How is it playing its role in the body's balance, posture maintenance and maintenance of the balance. Right. So let me start by saying that there are brain stem nuclei. There are nuclei in the brain stem. The nuclei are called vestibular nuclei. So, medulla, pons and midbrain, collectively called as the brain stem. And in the brain stem, we have these vestibular nuclei, the collections of nerve cells called as vestibular nuclei. And from these nuclei, there are descending tracts. The neurons descend down onto the spinal cord. Obviously, they would be called as vestibulospinal tracts. No problem there in understanding. From the vestibular nuclei to the spinal cord, the descending tracts would be called as vestibulospinal tracts. In fact, there are two in number, the medial vestibulospinal tracts and the lateral vestibulospinal tract. So, medial and lateral vestibulospinal tracts, they descend on the spinal cord, and of course from the spinal cord the next neuron, the lower motor neuron or the anterior motor neuron, goes to the concerned muscle groups. The muscle groups that I am talking about here, those are the groups, for example, extensors of the neck, which maintain the upright position of the head, then extensors of the back, then thigh muscles. All these muscles are said to be the anti-gravity muscles. They maintain our body's posture against the gravity. In the face of gravity, how can we maintain our upright posture? How can we maintain the head upright? It's because of these muscles. When these muscles contract or tone in these muscles increases, and that is how we can maintain the upright head and upright body posture. So, signals from the vestibulospinal tracts going to the spinal cord, and from the spinal cord the next neuron is going to these muscles, these muscle groups which I mentioned just now. They will maintain the upright head and upright body posture, or a desired posture. Let's say a desired posture, when some other groups will also come into play. One more, the reticular nuclei. In the brainstem there are also reticular nuclei, and from the reticular nuclei obviously there would be reticulospinal tracts. So, we have vestibulospinal and reticulospinal tracts. These reticulospinal tracts also are involved in the contraction of the trunk muscles. We are looking at the axial muscle groups of the body, more central muscles. Those are generally the anti-gravity muscles. They maintain our body's desired position in the face of gravity. Look, gravity is constantly pulling our head down. Gravity is constantly acting on our body, and yet we maintain the upright head and upright body posture. We maintain the balance and equilibrium of the body thanks to these muscles, the anti-gravity muscles. Extensor muscles of the body, except for the upper limbs. Upper limbs, the flexors are the anti-gravity muscles, but otherwise extensor muscles, extensors of the neck, extensors of the back, they are the ones involved in this particular function. Next point, are these nuclei the highest command center? No, these nuclei are getting signals from somewhere to act like this, and that is where comes the role of cerebellum. So, next into the circuit, let's bring in the cerebellum. You know, it's a part of the hindbrain, and well, let me just say this is a diagrammatic representation. So, cerebellum is the master coordinator for all the muscles of the body. All the muscles of the body have their map in the cerebellum. So, obviously, these anti-gravity muscles, postural muscles, the muscles that maintain equilibrium of the body, even they are represented in the cerebellum. To be more precise, there is a lobe of the cerebellum called as flocculonodular lobe. It is in this lobe where there is a functional division of the cerebellum called as vestibulocerebellum. So, an important part of the cerebellum to maintain the body's balance, the functional division, vestibulocerebellum. Let's just diagrammatically draw it. If this is the cerebellum shown diagrammatically, then one functional division, the vestibulocerebellum. this vestibulocerebellum is going to signal the vestibular nuclei and reticular nuclei, and thereby it will control the anti-gravity muscles, postural muscles, to maintain the body's balance. Cerebellum is also receiving inputs from the cortex. Cortex is always performing the voluntary function, as you are aware. This cortex is also sending signals into the cerebellum regarding either the body to be kept stand still or body is to be moved, and thereby to maintain the body's balance if it starts moving. So there could be horizontal linear acceleration, there could be vertical linear acceleration. Cortex is going to signal the cerebellum, and vestibulocerebellum will in turn, it will control the vestibular and reticular nuclei, and in fact it is controlling the vestibulospinal and reticulospinal tracts. As we have seen, these tracts are going to control the extensor muscles or the postural anti-gravity muscles for the body's equilibrium. Next point, how is it that the vestibulocerebellum gets the idea about the head position? Now we are entering a crucial area. Look, now the next part that needs to be understood is that the head is upright, but it is constantly getting pulled down by the gravitational force. Now this force has to be conveyed to the cerebellum. Or we are seated in a train and the train suddenly starts. This is horizontal linear acceleration. Head has suddenly thrust forward or in a particular direction. This information has to reach the cerebellum. This information has to reach the vestibular nuclei, so that then the appropriate muscles will be contracted and we will maintain our body's balance. Even though we might tend to go off balance, but muscles are contracted. So from where the signal arises regarding the position of the head or acceleration of the head or spinning around of the head, spinning of the body around its own axis, and that is where the role of vestibular apparatus comes in. So in the inner ear, in the petrous part of the temporal bone, there is labyrinth, and one part of the labyrinth is called as vestibular apparatus. We have in our inner ear the vestibular apparatus. Let's draw it diagrammatically here. There are three semicircular canals, the part of vestibular apparatus. So from this vestibular apparatus, the signals arise and they are sent to the vestibular nuclei, and the signals are also sent to the vestibulocerebellum. Now the circuit is getting complete. Imagine the vestibular apparatus in the inner ear. So in the head, in a sense, and therefore supposing the head is thrust forward or head is moved suddenly in a particular direction, there is going to be stimulation of the vestibular apparatus in the inner ear. This stimulation then will give rise to the signals which will be conveyed by the vestibular nerve. We will discuss all this in detail. Vestibular nerve, the 8th cranial nerve, will take the signals from this vestibular apparatus which has got stimulated because of the head movement. Head is moved either linear or vertical or around the axis. The signals start from the vestibular apparatus and they are sent to the vestibular nuclei in the brainstem and to the cerebellum, vestibulocerebellum, the functional division of the cerebellum. And then according to these inputs coming from the vestibular apparatus, the cerebellum can take further and further decisions in a very quick manner. Vestibulocerebellum will send the output signals to the vestibular nuclei and reticular nuclei, and from there, we have already discussed it, the signals are sent down on the spinal cord, and the muscles are, appropriate muscle groups will be contracted instantly so that we maintain the body's balance. We maintain the desired position of the head and desired posture of the body. So that completes our circuit. I have not shown the cortex in this, but the key components are the vestibular apparatus. Vestibular apparatus, which is a part of the head, it is inside the head, or rather in the inner ear. So whenever there is head movement, or even if the body is still and head is stationary, but still gravity is pulling the head down, even that gravitational pull is sensed by the vestibular apparatus, and any such stimulation then will be sent via vestibular nerve. It will signal the vestibular nuclei, and vestibulocerebellar tract will take those signals regarding the head movement into the cerebellum. Which part of the cerebellum? Vestibulocerebellum. And then vestibulocerebellum will send the output signals, which will come to these nuclei in the brainstem, the vestibular nuclei, reticular nuclei, and then vestibulospinal, reticulospinal tracts. That is the circuit for our equilibrium of the body during the standing posture, or whenever the head is still, or when there is linear acceleration of the head, horizontally, vertically, or there is rotation of the head. In all these situations, the signals are going to start from the vestibular apparatus, signals sent into the vestibulocerebellum, and as I referred to it, vestibulocerebellar tract, then signals will come out, and vestibulospinal, reticulospinal tract will be signaled about it. They will control the trunk muscles, anti-gravity muscles, axial muscles. So that is the circuit. Now coming to the next part of our discussion, with this in mind, let us describe the vestibular apparatus, because we need to understand how and where these signals are generated. When we start moving our head or rotating the head, how is it that the signals are generated in the vestibular apparatus, and then the further things will follow. So with that, we start the next part of the discussion, vestibular apparatus. So as I said, in the petrous part of the temporal bone, there is bony labyrinth, and inside that there is a system of coiled tubes. It's called as membranous labyrinth, or let's simply call it labyrinth for now. So we are talking about inner ear. Now this labyrinth has two structures. It is composed of two structures. There is cochlea and there is vestibular apparatus. You will see very often labyrinth and vestibular apparatus, these terms are used interchangeably. But to be more precise, let's divide it like this. Labyrinth has got two. Labyrinth basically is a system of coiled tubes, and it has got two parts, cochlear and vestibular apparatus. Let's show it diagrammatically. Cochlea is a coiled tube. It takes 2.5 turns upon itself. And then we have vestibular apparatus, which consists of utricle and saccule, and then the semicircular canals. I am going to describe this in some time now. This is just for the sake of introductory diagram. So here is a ductus endolymphaticus, and then we have these semicircular canals and utricle and saccule. So this will be the complete diagram of the labyrinth, and as I mentioned just now, there is cochlea which has taken the 2.5 turns upon itself, and it is the organ for hearing. And then this remaining part is the vestibular apparatus. And the nerve that starts from these is of course 8th cranial nerve. You know the 8th cranial nerve is vestibulocochlear nerve. So both these components of the labyrinth have the same nerve supply, that is 8th cranial nerve, the vestibulocochlear nerve. So from the cochlea, the auditory nerve will start, and from the vestibular apparatus, the vestibular component, the vestibular nerve. I mentioned briefly about the vestibular nerve. It starts from this vestibular apparatus and it sends signals to the vestibular nuclei of the brainstem and into the cerebellum as well. Cerebellum, the master coordinator, has to get these signals, only then it can control the muscle groups. Okay. So I think so far, the diagram is clear. Cochlea, vestibular apparatus. Moving further, we are right now interested in this part, the vestibular apparatus. So let's focus on this. Basically, the vestibular apparatus is composed of two parts. One part is made up of utricle and saccule, and the other part is composed of semicircular canals. They are 3 in number, so we will refer to them as 3 semicircular canals. Right. So whatever I described so far, that the signals will arise from the vestibular apparatus and will be sent into the cerebellum, into the vestibulocerebellum. They will also go to the vestibular nuclei of the brainstem. Those signals are arising from these structures in the inside the labyrinth. This is what is the vestibular apparatus. It is constantly detecting our head position. It is detecting our head movement, linear movement and angular movement as well. So that is the vestibular apparatus. Let's see the functions first and then the structure in detail. Utricle and saccule, they play the role in equilibrium when the head is stationary, head is static, and when there is linear acceleration of the head. So when the head is stationary, as I mentioned, gravity is pulling the head down, yet we maintain the upright position of the head, we maintain the body's desired posture. It's because the signals arising from this part of the vestibular apparatus, the utricle and saccule. And when the head has got linear acceleration, what we saw just now, while we are seated in a train and the train suddenly starts, the head has got a horizontal linear acceleration. Or we are standing in an elevator and elevator suddenly starts, it's a vertical linear acceleration. In all such circumstances, utricle and saccule play the role of maintenance of equilibrium of the body. Body's balance is maintained by these structures. I mean, the signals will arise from these structures and will be sent to those nuclei and cerebellum. The 3 semicircular canals, they are important, or they maintain the balance of the body when there is angular rotation of the head. So, linear acceleration, the signals will arise from utricle and saccule. Angular rotation of the head, the signals will start from the semicircular canals. The three semicircular canals shown here, let's write it down. These are the canals. And semicircular, it doesn't make a complete circle. So, it's a semicircular canal, the circle is broken. And utricle and saccule. Right. So, that's grossly the structure of the vestibular apparatus. The nerve that's starting from it, vestibular nerve. Okay, let's look at the structures in detail now. These structures and how they are how they generate the signal. That's now important to be understood. How the signals are generated when the head is moving. Right. So, let's start with utricle and saccule. Linear acceleration of the head. As we are sitting in a train or standing in an elevator, it's the function of the utricle and saccule to maintain the body, to maintain the equilibrium. So, first point, there is a sensory organ inside the utricle and saccule, and that sensory organ is called as macula. So, now we are discussing the structure of the vestibular apparatus. Having said this, that the vestibular apparatus has got two parts, I beg your pardon, it has got two parts, utricle and saccule and the semicircular canals. Now, we are looking at their structures one by one. So, utricle and saccule, first point already mentioned, linear acceleration of the head. Whenever that happens, the signals are going to arise from utricle and saccule. So, we are now looking into the details of those, how those signals are generated. Inside the utricle and saccule, there is a sensory organ called as macula. Now, macula inside the utricle, now we are coming to the core area, and therefore, I would appreciate if you concentrate and understand this very well. Then it will be easy to understand how they generate the signals. Macula inside the utricle is horizontal and macula inside the saccule is vertical. Let's draw it here first in this diagram. This is the utricle, this is the saccule, a diagrammatic representation. Macula inside the utricle is oriented horizontally, it is horizontal, something like this, and macula inside the saccule is vertical, like this. So, consider this is a person in front of you, and this is the head of that person. Inside the head, inside the inner ear, we are looking deep into the vestibular apparatus. Yes. So, if this is the head of that person facing us, and in the inner ear, we are looking. So, now it's easy to understand. Macula inside the utricle, the utricular macula is horizontal like this. If this is the head of that person, let's say the person is standing like this, oriented in this direction, and we are looking deep into the inner ear, into the labyrinth, into the vestibular apparatus. So, it will appear something like this. Horizontal macula, vertical macula. All right, that was the first very important aspect. and therefore utricle generates the signals when there is horizontal linear acceleration of the head. Utricle plays the role in body's balance maintenance, equilibrium, when there is horizontal linear acceleration of the head, as in the case of a train, movement of the train, sudden movement of the train. We will see further why it is so. But for now, what you should correlate is the direction of the macula or orientation of the macula, and therefore the role that it plays in either horizontal linear acceleration or vertical linear acceleration, as in the elevator. So, macula inside the utricle is horizontal, and therefore it will play the role in equilibrium. It will generate the impulses when the head is moved like this. We have already assumed that this is the head of a person who is in this oriented in this direction, and suddenly the head is moved. So it's a horizontal linear acceleration. Who will generate the signals about it and will send them to the cerebellum and vestibular nuclei? It will be the macula inside the utricle. Utricle will generate the signals because you can see the orientation of that macula is horizontal. We will describe it further, but for now I want you to take only this part. And if there is vertical linear acceleration of the head, if this person is now standing in an elevator and the elevator suddenly starts going up, so vertical linear acceleration of the head, then who will generate the signals about that head movement? It will be the saccule, because you can see inside the saccule there is a macula, the receptor organ, the sensory organ, and it is oriented vertically. So as the head starts going up, this is a person in an elevator. His head has been shown diagrammatically, and inside that head this macula in the saccule. Now as the head starts going up, you can see that the saccule has got a vertical macula, vertically oriented. So therefore that is going to generate the signals, as the direction of the head movement will be like this in a vertical direction. It will be the macula inside the saccule. If the head starts going like this horizontally, then it will be the macula inside the utricle, which will generate the signals. Macula inside the utricle, horizontal, and in the saccule, vertical macula. All right. I wanted you to only understand this particular fact. Very often the students miss out on this fact, and then they don't understand which signal is being generated by which part. So macula inside the saccule is vertical, and therefore it will generate the signals when there is vertical linear acceleration of the head. Vertical linear acceleration of the head, as in an elevator. The signals will be generated by the saccule, or rather macula inside the saccule. So I hope you have you've got the orientation so far as to what is the structure, because we are going to have some further deep dive into this structure. So moving further, the macula inside the utricle is horizontal like this. Now I am having an enlarged view of those maculae in the utricle and saccule. So here is a macula inside the utricle. It's horizontal. And then macula inside the saccule, it's vertical. Yes. So it will now be easy to understand what I mean by horizontal orientation and the vertical orientation. There. Horizontal, vertical. And we are essentially talking about a man who is standing like this. We are having a look into the inner ear. Inner ear has that labyrinth. Inside the labyrinth there is vestibular apparatus. Vestibular apparatus has utricle and saccule. So this is the macula inside the utricle, and this vertical is the macula inside the saccule. Hope so far the things are clear, and if they are, then we will move on further. Now that having discussed so far which part is going to generate the signals when the head is either moving horizontally or vertically, once that is clear, now what remains is how are those signals generated. Now that is the most micro part of it, or rather deepest into the understanding of vestibular apparatus. So have the focus on this particular part, and then the picture will be completely clear. Inside the maculae, there are receptor cells called as hair cells. Hair cells. So how are they positioned? Now hair cells in the utricle are oriented like this in a linear fashion. They are lined up like this, one after the other in a linear fashion, right? So macula inside the utricle, horizontal. I am saying this umpteenth time, I know, but it should get completely consolidated. And macula inside the saccule, vertical. So if the man and his head moves forward like this, the utricular macula is going to be stimulated and it is going to generate the signals. And if it's a vertical linear acceleration as an elevator, then macula of the saccule will generate the signals. Let's see how. So hair cells are the receptor cells. They are the ones which are going to be excited by the movement of the head and by the angular rotation and so on. So hair cell, a flask shaped cell, and inside the utricle the hair cells are lined up like this, and inside the saccule, look, the macula inside the saccule is vertical. So hair cells are lined up like this. This is just a diagrammatic representation for now, but it will give you a fair idea as to how the hair cells are oriented. Okay, a quick few points about the hair cells. It is the hair cell which is going to detect that movement of the head and accordingly generate the signals. Hair cell is a flask shaped cell. It's a flask shaped cell like this. And at the top of the hair cell, there are hair which project upward. They are called as stereocilia. The hair that project upward from the hair cell, they are called as stereocilia. And the point to be noted is, from one end to the other end of the hair cell, the length of the stereocilia goes on increasing. Each next stereocilium is longer than the preceding one. As you can see here, length goes on increasing. And the longest one is on one end. Longest is on one end, and that is called as kinocilium. So, hair with increasing length and the greatest length is, hair is on one end, which is called as kinocilium. Kinocilium, because that is going to have the directional sensitivity. In which direction the head is moving, that directional sensitivity will be provided by the kinocilium. I'll describe how. So, hair cell, and then sides and bases of the hair cell synapses with the 8th cranial nerve fiber, vestibular nerve fibers. Vestibular nerve fibers synapse with the sides and bases of the hair cell. So, now when the head is stationary, there is a continuous steady discharge of neurotransmitter, and mind you, most of the excitatory transmission in the CNS is by the glutamate. So, even here it is going to be glutamate. There is a steady release of glutamate, and there will be steady impulse traffic in the vestibular nerve. I repeat once again, when there is no movement of the head, when the head is stationary completely, there is a steady release of glutamate, the neurotransmitter, by the hair cell, which excites the vestibular nerve fibers. You can see that there is a synapse over here, and the release of glutamate will excite the vestibular nerve fiber, and there will be steady impulse traffic in the vestibular nerve fibers. So, even if when we are stationary, head is static, there are steady impulses, steady number of impulses or steady impulse traffic in the vestibular nerve fibers. And that steady impulse traffic in the vestibular nerve fiber going where? Going to the cerebellum, going to the vestibular nuclei. We have already seen this. Will then contract the postural muscles, anti-gravity muscles, and we maintain the upright posture of the body. So, that is already known to us. We have added just this part, the steady impulse traffic, even when the head is not moving at all. Now, when the head moves in a particular direction, because of that movement, the stereocilia will bend towards the kinocilium. How? I will talk about it in about 5 minutes. When stereocilia bend towards the kinocilium in this direction, they all will bend together. Then the hair cell will be depolarized. Hair cell will get depolarized. You know why? Because at the top of the hair cell or at the bottom end of the stereocilia, there are potassium channels. Top of the hair cells, or let's say at near the bottom end of the stereocilia, there are potassium channels. So, when the head moves in a particular direction, there is going to be bending of the stereocilia toward the kinocilium. I mean, all of these will bend toward the kinocilium. That will open the potassium channels, and potassium present in the fluid surrounding these cells. Potassium is present high in the endolymph, and it is the endolymph which surrounds the hair cells. So, this potassium will enter through the potassium channels. Hair cell will depolarize, that will open the calcium channels in the hair cell membrane. Calcium will come in, and the neurotransmitter glutamate, as I mentioned, will be released into this synapse. So, now hair cell got depolarized. Initially there was no depolarization of the hair cell, just a steady discharge of glutamate even when the head was stationary. But now the head has been moved in a particular direction, and we will see why this depolarization happens. Head moved in a particular direction, and because of that the stereocilia, they all bend toward the kinocilium. That opens the potassium channels over here at the top of the hair, or rather, I beg your pardon, at the top of the hair cell here, and potassium will enter through these potassium channels. Potassium is high in the endolymph, so it comes in, hair cell got depolarized, calcium channels will open, calcium will come in, and more neurotransmitter will be released. So hair cell was depolarized, there was increased release of glutamate at the synapse, and the number of impulses in the vestibular nerve will increase. That is a type of signal to convey to the cerebellum about the direction of the movement. Because on the contrary, if the head moves in the opposite direction, I mentioned a particular direction, if the head moves opposite to that, then the hair cells move away from the kinocilium in the opposite direction, and because of that the hair cell will hyperpolarize. So when the stereocilia bend toward the kinocilium, and when did that happen? When the head moved in a particular direction. Here the stereocilia moved toward the kinocilium and the hair cell was depolarized, and that resulted in increased neurotransmitter release and increased impulse traffic in the vestibular nerve. So more number of impulses being sent to the cerebellum and to the vestibular nuclei. That is how the direction is conveyed, because then, on the other hand, if the direction is opposite, the head movement is in the opposite direction, then this time the stereocilia will bend away from the kinocilium in this direction, opposite direction, because your head movement was in the opposite direction. And now the hair cell will hyperpolarize this time. The impulse traffic in the vestibular nerve will decrease. So now let me summarize this. When the head was stationary, there was a steady impulse traffic in the vestibular nerve going to the cerebellum, going to the vestibular nuclei. When head moves in a particular direction, impulse traffic in the vestibular nerve increases. When the head moves in the opposite direction, the impulse traffic in the vestibular nerve will decrease. That is how the direction of the head movement is conveyed to the cerebellum and to the vestibular nuclei, and then accordingly the appropriate muscle groups will be contracted, and thereby the body's balance will be maintained. If the head is moving forward like this, there will be depolarization of the hair cells. If the head is moved backward like this, the stereocilia will move in the opposite direction, bend in the opposite direction, the hair cell will hyperpolarize and vestibular nerve discharges will decrease. So from the vestibular nerve traffic and its frequency, the direction is being conveyed to the cerebellum, whether the head moved in a particular direction or the opposite direction, and accordingly the appropriate muscles of the trunk and back, they will be contracted and we will maintain the body's balance. So that is about the hair cell. What I wanted you to understand here is that how is it that the head movement in a particular direction is sensed by the hair cell, and how does it generate the impulse traffic in the vestibular nerve fibers. Let's have further view on this. We have seen this, that there are hair cells lined up like this inside the utricle, inside the saccule, and I've also mentioned that sides and bases of the hair cells synapse with the 8th cranial nerve fibers, vestibular nerve fibers. All right. Let's draw the vestibular nerve fibers synapsing with the hair cells, of the utricle and hair cells inside the saccule. Now, another structural uniqueness or important part is at the top of the maculae, there is a gelatinous layer. Top of the maculae, you can see here, this is the top of the macula over here. And this gelatinous layer consists of, or it has calcium carbonate crystals. We have drawn the calcium carbonate crystals at the top of the maculae. Now, these calcium carbonate crystals are called as otoconia. Otoconia, or some authors also call them statoconia. Otoconia or statoconia. Calcium carbonate crystals at the top of the maculae. These calcium carbonate crystals or otoconia, they have got 2.5 times, 2.5 times greater specific gravity compared to these other structures. 2.5 times greater specific gravity as compared to the hair cells and the other structures. So, they are stony, the calcium carbonate crystals which have been shown here at the top. They are stony hard, high specific gravity, and due to this is also called as otolith organs. These utricle and saccule are also referred to as otolith organs. Oto is ear, lith is because of those stony crystals. Lithos, lith, that's stony. So, otolith organs, these utricle and saccule, because of the presence of these calcium carbonate crystals at the top, that's a gelatinous layer. Now, the point is, the stereocilia, which you can see in the diagram, they are projected upward and they are tucked in that gelatinous layer. If you can imagine this, the stereocilia, the hair which are projecting upward, they are tucked in that gelatinous layer, which that layer has the calcium carbonate crystals. With that understanding, now let us try to understand how the hair cells are stimulated, how they get depolarized or hyperpolarized. Yeah. So, let's again assume that this is a person and we are looking inside the head of this person. So, we are looking at the maculae inside this person, the person standing like this, and macula inside the utricle, horizontal, macula inside the saccule, vertical, and you can see how the hair cells are lined up. Now, the man seated in a train like this, and the train suddenly starts with a jerk. Can you imagine this? This is a man seated in a train like this, in this direction, and the train suddenly starts. So, this will be the direction of the head movement, right? This will be the direction. Head is thrust forward or in this direction because the train started suddenly. Now, what happens is the head suddenly moves forward and therefore, the hair cells will also move in that same direction. This is a magnified view. Imagine the head suddenly moved. Now, the macula also moved in the same direction, but the calcium carbonate crystals at the top, they have got higher specific gravity, they will not move instantly. Can you imagine these? These are the calcium carbonate crystals with high specific gravity at the top, that gelatinous layer. they will not move instantly. Why? Because they have more weight, they have more specific gravity, they are heavy, so they will not move instantly. So we have a scenario whereby the head moved because the train has started moving, and macula moved in the same direction as that of the head, but those crystals did not move instantly, and therefore the stereocilia will bend. Because you know why they will bend in the opposite direction? Because there is going to be a relative opposite movement. Let me tell you what is relative opposite movement. If you are sitting in a car is moving, you look out of the window, you see that the trees and the objects are going back. Now that's a relative opposite movement. In reality, what is happening is you are moving forward, the trees are stationary. But what do you feel actually is that the trees are going back. That's not actually happening. They are stationary and you are moving forward. So that's a relative opposite movement. Same thing happens here, that the macula moves as the head has started moving, because the train has started moving and you are seated in that train. But those calcium carbonate crystals will not move instantly, because they are heavier, they have got more specific gravity, and this is a relative opposite movement. I mean, these are stationary, the calcium carbonate crystals, but the macula has moved forward like this. So how is it perceived? Listen to this. How is it perceived? Is that hair cells are stationary and calcium carbonate crystals have gone back. Remember I told you, relative opposite movement. What actually is happening is head is moving in this direction, macula is moving in this direction, and therefore hair cells are moving, but the calcium carbonate crystals are not moving, they are stationary, and therefore how is it perceived? It is perceived as if the macula is stationary, the hair cells are stationary, and those crystals are going back. That is how it is perceived. Relative opposite movement. In reality, what is happening is hair cells are moving, but those crystals are stationary. But what is actually perceived is hair cells are stationary and calcium carbonate crystals or otoconia are going back. And as you can see, therefore, because the stereocilia, the hair, are tucked in that gelatinous layer, and since these crystals did not move and the macula moved, the stereocilia bend in the opposite direction. Mark my sentence again. Stereocilia bend in the opposite direction. Opposite of what? Opposite of the head movement. Head was moving like this. It started moving like this. But stereocilia will bend in the opposite direction because of this kind of a structure, because of the high specific gravity otoconia at the top of that gelatinous layer. So this will make the person believe that he or she is falling in the opposite direction, and therefore you will observe that when the train is thrust in a particular direction, you tend to perceive a relatively opposite movement first, and then you contract the muscles in the same direction to stop your fall. I'll describe it in a certain way or a different way to make you understand. What I'm trying to say is that when the head moves in a particular direction and maculae move in the particular direction, but because the stereocilia bend in the opposite direction because of this particular structural uniqueness, what is going to happen is we feel the perception of fall in the opposite direction. Actually, the train has moved in a direction, the perception of fall will be in the opposite direction, and then the muscles are contracted to prevent that fall, and that is how we maintain the body's balance. So that's how horizontal linear acceleration. Same thing will happen with vertical linear acceleration. That is perceived by the macula inside the saccule. When the head starts going up, I mean the person is now in an elevator. Elevator suddenly starts going up. So this time it's the saccule which will play the role in balance. How? Look, macula will start going up along with the lift, along with the elevator, like this. So hair cells will move, but these calcium carbonate crystals, the otoconia, will not move. They are heavier, and therefore the stereocilia bend in the opposite direction. The stereocilia will bend in the opposite direction, downward direction, when the head is going up, and that will open the potassium channels, as I described already. Potassium channels at the top of the hair, they will open, and the further things will happen. The vestibular nerve discharge will increase, and that will allow the cerebellum to contract our anti-gravity muscles and maintain the body's posture. So that was about vertical linear acceleration and horizontal linear acceleration, and the role played by the maculae and the role played by the hair cells and otoconia. One more thing, this will be interesting. Look, when the train suddenly starts, only at that time we feel this as if we are going off balance. But when it picks up a certain speed, after that we don't feel as if we are going off balance. Why? Because after a few seconds, even these otoconia at the top of the macula, they will pick up the same speed as that of your head. Initially they did not move, right? And therefore it was as if they are going in the opposite direction, relative opposite movement, if you have taken that point clearly. Actually the head was moving along with the train, but it was perceived as if the head was stationary, or the hair cells were stationary, and the otoconia were going in the opposite direction. That was the perception, relative opposite movement, right? But then this relative opposite movement will stop within a few seconds, because initially they had a higher inertia. They had 2.5 times greater specific gravity, weight, and therefore they had inertia. But then in a few seconds time, what happens is, even these calcium carbonate crystals, the otoconia, they will pick up the speed. I mean, they will start moving, and they will come into the same speed as that of the train and as that of your head. That means now they will also start moving with the same speed. So no more bending of the stereocilia. Stereocilia will come back to their position, and that means the perception of your going off balance will stop. Why that perception was created? Because of the perception means actually it was happening because of this, that the head was moving, but otoconia were stationary. That caused bending of the stereocilia. So that created that perception. But then as otoconia start moving with the same speed as that of the head and as that of the hair cells, then there is no more bending of the stereocilia. They will come back to their original upright original position, and signaling will stop. Signaling in the vestibular nerve fibers will stop. So now in a moving train also, you are quite happily balanced and equilibrium. No more sensation of falling over or going off balance. However, let's say the train was moving in this particular direction. The man standing like this in the train, and the train was moving with a certain speed, and train suddenly stops. Suddenly means not that suddenly, but it stops. What happens now? the opposite events will happen. The head will stop instantly. The hair cells will stop instantly. But those otoconia, they had picked up the speed, so they will continue to move for a while. And now the stereocilia will now bend in the opposite direction. Again, you will get the sensation or perception of a fall. If a moving train suddenly stops, not train, let's say, because that's a little difficult to imagine that a train was moving and suddenly stopped. No, let's say a car, moving car suddenly stops. What happens? You tend to go off balance. Have you ever experienced that? Because you had acquired that same speed. Your head had acquired that same speed. And actually head means those otoconia, calcium carbonate crystals, had taken up that speed. So what happens is, when the head stops suddenly, car has stopped suddenly, but those otoconia will still move for a while in that same direction in which the car was moving. And therefore, now the hair cell stationary and otoconia are still moving in that same direction. So now stereocilia will bend in the opposite direction. When the train started, they had moved backward. Now they will move forward in the opposite direction, in the direction where the car was going or the train was going. So that is how we feel the perception of going off balance in different ways when the train starts and then when the train stops. The directions of our off balance, direction of our disequilibrium is different when the train starts and when the train stops. This is the reason for that. And you can see with the vertical linear acceleration, it's the macula inside the saccule. Same thing. The head starts moving up, so hair cells start moving up, but these otoconia will not move initially. They have an inertia because they have got more weight, they have got more specific gravity, and therefore there will be bending of the hair, bending of the stereocilia in the downward position. Means head was going up, stereocilia bends in the downward direction, and that creates the perception of going off balance. So that was utricle and saccule and their role in equilibrium. When there is horizontal linear acceleration and when there is vertical linear acceleration. Well, next part we will see the angular rotation of the head. We will talk about semicircular canals, and then in the end we will discuss about those things like vertigo and seasickness, motion sickness, nystagmus, and so on and so forth. So let's divide this video into two parts. The second part will be about the semicircular canals and their function and the applied aspect.